Sure. Gladly. Yeah, I'm Anthony. Actually, I worked for a company called Relic Store, and we develop a storage solution for robotics and industrial IoT. And so this is why it's very interesting for me, this meeting, because I mean, we are exactly in the space where we are right now figuring out how to actually store that type of data, because we come from the industrial IoT space. And so we have a storage solution to store like high frequency image data, for example, images or high frequency vibration data in chunks. And I know that robotic data is quite big, right? And so you also don't want to store everything in the cloud. So yeah, but for me, this type of exercise makes perfect sense and very interesting.
Hi, my name is Rick Hernandez. I'm a robotics engineer. I'm right now working on a couple different projects, and just wanted to see what I can do to participate in this group and kind of learn from the community a little bit more.
Um, I can think of lightweight telemetry, right? Like poses, joint states, and so on. No worries. I was thinking of lightweight telemetry, like pose of the robots or joint states. Is it the same? And
What about like environmental? I mean, this is highly going to be dependent on what the objective is, the robot's objective, the mission objective. Is it indoor, outdoor? And what's the objective that the people collecting the data are trying to accomplish? So that's going to determine what type of sensors they're collecting data. So there could be a lot of sensors or just a few. Right. And even like accelerometer information, and it's coordinates and stuff like that of what's happening to it, its internal versus external temperatures, the conditions of each component could also be sensor data, motor, temperatures, speed, RPMs, stuff like that.
so the state of the robots and the state of the environment, right?
Mhm.
Kind of, yeah.
Like battery condition too. Mhm.
Mm. Mhm.
Yeah, it could also be determination of something that's, more mounted permanently versus something more like a payload type of sensor. Because it could be a manufacturing robot arm, it could be, a mobile robot, it could be an aquatic or even aerial robot. It just depends on what it is.
Mm. Some kind of status, right? Or events. If something happens, maybe they want to have a flag or something. Mm.
What about with its membership within like a collective or a swarm, and so it knows what it's doing and then what everyone else is doing? A little different than obstacle avoidance is one thing, or just detection, but it's also where is it within the overall mission?
Mm. Oh, we forgot GPS then. Yeah, localization. Mm.
What about its like communication status or its broadcasting status if it's aerial? I mean, it doesn't have to. It's not limited to aerial, but like example, it's broadcasting its own ID if it's aerial, so that way it's more compliant with any kind of local regulations or laws, and when it's entering airspace, or it's identifying itself amongst other when it's either going across certain boundaries or going in a particular mile marker or milestone. It would be able to identify itself, and so it's broadcasting out and keeping track of whether it's it's something's receiving it and acknowledging it and communicating back to it. So just general communications as well. Well, there's messages in terms of like ROS concepts where they're just communicating internal process, but this is more of communications of acknowledgement, which in turn can get translated into messages at some point down the chain, but it's at least it starts to affect it because it's got to relay it back to the operator or make decisions based on that. if it's going to like an LLM or some other type of decision maker. I mean, are you also trying to track like what network it's communicating? So if it's sending a signal, it's like, say, for instance, aerial, or it's a mobile robot, and it's going through a 5G versus another type of network. Are you trying to track what network it's on and the latency and the condition of that connection? Yeah, all of it. hmm And what encryption and all the other things that go with that. hmm
Mm. Yeah, for the size, it's kind of either -10 or +10, right? Because you have kind of very lightweight text like telemetry, or very raw data like images or lighter frames. But is there something in the middle? I might be maybe not. Mm.
It could be wrong. It almost sounds like you're kind of talking about intervals as well. So example, if it's every 5 minutes, it's updating, or if it's real time, like every few seconds or fractions of seconds, versus like 2-3 hours or 4 days, there could be large variances in the amount of data that's being transferred. Text could even, kilobits, if it's frequent enough, or it could be several gigs, depending on the, what interval it's set at. I have a question. Is this more or less to put together just kind of an overall, here's a possible list of all the sensors or applications, kind of things to look out and when you're developing some kind of a cloud platform for robotics management and operations, or is there a specific objective of this spreadsheet? Oh, okay. Okay. So what we could do is break it down based on almost type, like almost establish some type of here's the, I don't want to say core, but more of the general, compute and memory, and how much storage does it have, and some basic functionality, and then things might be more specific, humanoid versus wheeled versus aerial, type of platform application, unless if you're trying to be more specific to a certain type, because then what you could do is break it down further and say, okay, what kind of sensors? Because you might have a joint sensor on, or joint positioning or estimation on a humanoid, but not necessarily on other platforms. And so it really allows people to kind of do a deep dive into each application to say, okay, well, on this, here's the things that you should kind of look out for, almost like a benchmark, list, and saying these are the things, and here's some KPIs if you kind of think in that direction, or even ways to measure, establish baselines on that. And so it could be a really incredibly useful list, of here's things that you may or may not think about as you're pulling together, your list of sensors and what you should be tracking, or might be helpful, and explanations of each. Why do I want this sensor? Why do I want this data versus this other data? And it goes like, oh, I realize now the value of this, based on the description or something. And so it'd be incredibly valuable, at least to me.
So replication, you mean how much history you have on the robot and how much history you have in the cloud, right? Like we differentiate the two. Uh, oh, sorry, I misheard. No, I was thinking how because if you want to store data, you don't want everything, right? We can estimate, okay, you have that much certain amount which is generated on the robot, and you want to keep downsampled version of all that data, right? Or based on events, or depends. And maybe you even want to keep some data long term for legal reasons, and could be different columns as well, like columns.
I think that's a good point that Anthony has. Is I think it also depends on what the objective is, because sometimes you may want to analyze everything, and then you're looking for, it could be more of an iterative development process, or you're analyzing a lot of historical data. So in some cases, you may want everything, as much as the system can capture. In other instances, you say you do need to, downsample, or you need to reduce. You say, well, I don't really need all that information. I just need, a certain, time period or certain types of information. Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, and if you're trying to catalog and create like a master list, you do want to indicate, because you're going to have multiple temperature readings from different sensors and even, assemblies themselves. It just, again, it depends on what it is that's on board, what you're trying to accomplish. But example, like, with aquatic or marine or maritime systems, moisture is going to be huge, because it could be, a hull breach or something. Whereas something that's on a warehouse floor, that's, moving pallets around, maybe not so much, And so it's going to be a pretty important factor. And I think, at least from, I think my understanding of your initiative is to, list everything so we can kind of pick and choose what makes the most sense. Yeah, I think if you were going to put a graph in there, it might be like a pie chart in terms of, and it would depend on the application. So you can kind of see where the categories of either sensors or type of data that's being collected, what proportionate, example, like this type of data, video data consumes most of the actual data size. But in terms of, the data points, it's less. And so it really is going to be a comparative between the tabular lists. So more of a table would, or just, an Excel spreadsheet would be very helpful, with columns to kind of say, here's the categories, here's the types of sensors that are, within the categories, and some of the data points that you want to capture from that sensor. Not all sensors can give the data points. And so you kind of want to almost reduce it down to the lowest common denominator of each type of sensor within each category. And that's based on the application. One thing that might help is if you maybe pick a particular, platform or form factor, like humanoid, or whichever of interest, and then use it as an example, almost like an outline example of, here's kind of the idea of what you're doing, and then open it up to the community so that way they can start to fill in the gaps for all the other applications. I'm sorry, I'm going to put you on hold for one.
You share the Google Sheet, right? Uh, yes, I'm on the Google Doc, but you don't share the doc. You don't share the right screen. Yes. Right.
What I think that goes again to the objective is, I mean, there could be an outlier cases is yes, we want to see, can we capture everything? And then there's the more practical of no, we only want certain information. And so I think it's you, if there's, the goal is to have a comprehensive list, then you put that there and then you put within parameters, everything or certain things or, whatever the case is. And so if you're trying to build a cloud platform that manages all this, then you really need to kind of define, here's the parameters in which we're going to allow you to do this. So you're setting the boundaries, or whoever's building the platform is setting the boundaries. And so that way you could say, capture everything, which could be a tremendous amount of data in, a lot of resources, or it's somehow filtering it down to, to meet a very specific objective. But I think that objective would need to be defined. And that could be variable based on if it's a SaaS product, each client or each tenant within, within the product. Mhm. I'm not aware of like a pen. You'd have to have an applicator on top of it, but you're just trying to capture everything or select. Well, that still would depend on what the objective is, because you're it's assumed that if under development you're trying to capture everything to study it and to improve, through an iterative process to improve either the process or product or mission or whatever the case is. If you're trying to use it for historical analysis, even during production, you still may want to do that. It just depends on what that actually is. So the variability of what the objective you're trying to accomplish is going to be a major impact, because example, if you're trying to capture as much data points and to establish patterns of some type of vehicle going through, say for instance, the ocean and mapping the floor, and you're trying to capture everything it can possibly can for some reason. I'm not saying that's practical, but just for discussion purposes, then, and you want to be able to go back on that. And so each time it does a trip, a particular area, you're doing this comparative analysis outside of this. So is this like an operating type of platform where it's controlling it and managing it? Then you probably want to filter certain things, because a lot of data you don't really need. If it's trying to use it and almost create like a data warehouse or a data lake of just gathering everything, and you're trying to now process that, then the objectives are different, because you really do want to capture more information because you're using that data differently. Yeah, so to have a comprehensive list of saying here are some sensors to take a look at, that would be helpful, and more of a almost like a index or some type of glossary of saying here's kind of what they do, what's its purpose behind it, its averages, what is most I don't know, missions or most companies utilize this amount of data, but you can go, higher or lower. It's kind of some kind of baseline to judge against might be helpful. But just having that list of saying, oh wow, yeah, I didn't realize that we could do these things in these kinds of sensor suites. Because you have a lot of different variability depending on the sensor. Because even within sensor, they change based on the categories. Like what kind of sensors? Accelerometer is going to be kind of consistent, but there could be others like video. Like, well, what kind of video from what kind of camera or what kind of system? LiDAR. Like, well, what kind? How much of that information are you capturing? And at what interval is it? Is it basically it's over the air updates, or is it essentially connecting, storing it to like a local storage and then uploading it in intervals?
Mm. And we can still try to define some rule of thumbs for 99% of the use cases, right? Because in practical settings, you never want to save everything in the cloud. Like if you have LiDAR generating like 1 terabyte per hour, it's not realistic to use the entire bandwidth just for that, right? So I think it's realistic to say like heavy, like raw sensor data, LiDAR images, you store everything on the robot, and then you replicate only a downsampled version of that to the cloud at 1 hertz. And in case of events, that the user define, you replicate the data. For example, if there is incidents, you replicate the path, I don't know, 5 minutes. You copy that to the cloud, right? So you can analyze the event. And then all the images that are stored at 1 hertz to the cloud, you can use it for um, finding incidents, for example, or analysis. But you don't need all the images in the cloud anyway, even in development. Or maybe there are some like use cases where you need it, but it's probably not the 99% of the use cases. I have a silly question. In development, because I used to work on mobile robots, but in development we didn't store anything in the cloud, right? We had a bunch of JSON nanos, and we were just having all the data available on the robot. And so would it make sense actually to say everything in the cloud is already production data, or you still see use cases where we would want to have during development data in the cloud? Yeah, it makes sense actually.
Is gathering this sensor data, is this for like managing or operating a robot system or a fleet, or is it just hypothetical? Is this example, like we're going through a list and saying, here's, as you identified, data collection categories. So we're kind of listing here some different, sensors and the types of data, and whether you keep it long term, short term, in the cloud, local, that's all to be determined. Is this really for the main purpose of operating or actually controlling a single system or a fleet of systems, kind of like Amazon Scout? Is it trying to do hundreds, if not thousands, of these things nationwide, or is there a different objective? Mhm. Mhm. Yes, thank you.
Yes. No, I agree with the other meeting. I think it would be great to extend it a little bit before.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'd be help to have a more clear, defined not only objective but instructions of kind of how do we want to contribute. That way, it helps clear the goal. Because then the whole audience can, or general community can actually say, okay, now I understand what they're trying to accomplish, how I can actually add value to this, and then go ahead and continue to do that. I think that's going to be really important to kind of get the overall outcome and benefit that you're hoping to accomplish. Oh yeah, definitely. I don't specifically, but thank you. I don't want to cut anyone off, so I was trying to be careful not to want Anthony to go first. Both. The meeting, like what specifically are we trying to do? Because I don't think necessarily developing out the entire spectrum of options would be realistic. So it's more, let's focus on what the publication's objective is, have a consensus on that. And that way we could define out, here's the publication, here's the instructions, here's, the goal, the purpose, the scope, their project charter almost. And then that way you can publish it, announce it to the community, and then they can start filling in a lot of gaps and start contributing. You're going to get quite a bit more productivity that way, at least in my opinion. Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you very much. Hope you have a great day.
Yeah.